Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So there's a lot of talk around maritime decarbonization, and it is expected that these greenhouse gas emissions, the regulations around it, the targets, goals, they will inadvertently drive a good volume of the old aging fleet, which will be considered as inefficient in future towards the recycling yard. Now, there was a major milestone that was accomplished last year when the Hong Kong Convention came into force, because before that there was no uniform regulation governing the recycling of ship. And when we talk about the sustainability, it should not be just at the shipyard level or during the operational life of the ship. It should be also addressing the end of life ships as well. So Hong Kong Convention very ideally puts the safety and environmentally sound practices at the gist of it. That's the very much of its core. And with this maritime decarbonization, as it is expected, the older ships will be replaced by a newer, much more efficient fleet. And in fact, last year when the Hong Kong Convention came into force, BIMCO estimated that in this decade, by 2032, more than 15,000 ships will be recycled. However, as it stands today, the ship recycling volumes are at the 20-year low. The reason is, the reason is simply the geopolitical tensions, the Red Sea diversions, whereby the higher or larger number of ships are required to ship the same volume of cargo through the Cape of Good Hope. But sooner or later, this ship recycling activity will rebound, and there's 1 year to go for the Hong Kong Convention. But then there is still, within this 1 year and going forward, there is still a lot of uncertainties and complexities around the regulatory framework. So in my presentation today, I will be discussing all these factors and what is the cost. I mean, if you don't comply with it, either knowingly or unknowingly, what could be the consequences of it. So without further ado, let me show you in a very short summary of what are the regulations. So I mentioned about the Hong Kong Convention. It was adopted in 2009, and after 14 years, last year, it was ratified after 14 years. And since it was ratified last June, it will come into force 2 years from now, that is next year in June, 26 June 2025 to be precise. Now, Hong Kong Convention applies to ships of 500 gross tonnage and over, and those who are engaged in international voyages. There are certain exceptions like warships or domestic fleet, which are not covered under this. But Hong Kong Convention also applies to the ship recycling facilities so that it addresses the working and environmental conditions of those ship recycling facilities. Apart from the Hong Kong Convention, which should be the primary regulation governing the ship recycling, there is a Basel Convention and its Ban Amendment. Now, the Basel Convention basically regulates transboundary movement of hazardous waste. It doesn't mention anything about the ship recycling. But owing to the fact that the ship, end-of-life ship to be precise, might be containing toxic waste like asbestos, hydrocarbons, when it's going for scrap or recycling, the Basel Convention provisions will be applicable. Ban Amendment goes a step further. It prohibits the transboundary waste movement of hazardous waste from those countries that have explicitly signed it. Basically, the OECD countries, the developed countries who have signed the Ban Amendment, they can't send the ships to any of the non-OECD countries. And then we have the EU regulations. The EU in 2006 adopted the provisions of the Basel Convention and its Ban Amendment in its waste shipment regulation. And EU also adopted in 2013 a ship recycling regulation in order to early to facilitate early ratification or early implementation of Hong Kong Convention within the EU region. Now, all these regulations only add to more complexities, more tensions. What do we need to comply with? And one of the regulations which I have not mentioned in this slide is the UAE ship recycling regulation, which entered into force end of March. And it is precisely a copy of EU ship recycling regulation. And it has the same sort of terms. And it doesn't only apply to UAE flagships, it also applies to the other foreign flagships that are visiting UAE port. So you can see there's a lot of complexity and legal uncertainty around it. So during this recently concluded MEPC 81 meeting, the industry organizations submitted a paper at IMO level to ask that there should be a level play field, especially for the Basel Band or Basel Convention parties. They need to choose one way or the other. Now, one of the primary requirements of all these recycling regulations, whether it be the Hong Kong Convention or the UAE or EU recycling regulation, the ships need to have inventory of hazardous material on board. Now, for EU flagships, this requirement has been enforced from 31st December 2018, and non-EU flagship visiting EU region from 31st December 2020. So, ship owners with EU flagships or trading in EU region might be very well aware of it. But now that Hong Kong Convention is ratified and it will be entering into force from next year, this requirement will be much more wider, much more globally required. So it gives a good standing area where we can learn from the past incidents, because when in 2020 the IHM requirement came into force, somehow it was shadowed by the COVID and the complexities around the COVID and all those things. So it didn't play out very well. But now, learning the lessons from that time, we can probably, the second wave of IHM, where larger fleet will be requiring, the fleet that is not trading to EU, will need to comply with it. They need to have an inventory of hazardous material. Essentially, for the new ships that are built on or after 26th of June 2025, they need to have an IHM on board. And for existing ships, they need to have IHM on board by 2030, 26 June 2030, or if they are going for recycling before that. Now, IHM basically consists of three parts. What needs to be there on board for during the operational life of the ship is IHM Part 1, which only talks about the hazardous materials in the ship structure and equipment. Part 2 and Part 3 are only required when the ship is going for recycling. Now, IHM Part 1 needs to be maintained. So the companies need to have policy in place, procurement policy, which should be addressing that whenever they are getting any equipment which will be a part of ship structure or equipment, then there needs to be a material declaration as well as the supplier's declaration of conformity. So there is a need to amend the safety management system to have all these provisions taken into care by the time the Hong Kong Convention provisions applies to the ships. Now, apart from IHM, there are other documents required as well. So if the ship is going for recycling, and now that we know that the major ship recycling facilities around the globe, whether it be India, whether it be Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey, these countries recycle near about 95% of the world tonnage. They are all parties to the Hong Kong Convention. So if the ships are going for recycling at any of these facilities, they need to ensure that it's a compliant facility. For a compliant facility, it will be having a ship recycling facility plan. Based on that, the IHM, apart from IHM Part 1, Part 2 and 3 will need to be prepared, which will be submitted to the recycling facility. And then they will prepare a ship recycling plan. All of this will need to be reviewed by the class, and then the international ready for recycling certificate will be issued. So that's It's a bit complicated, but in general, these are the requirements around the ship recycling. Now, from an insurance perspective, now this rule is from the UK P&I Club, but having worked with another IG P&I Club, it's pretty much similar. Because there is a change in the material risk for the ship, the insurers need to be informed well in advance if the ship is decided to be recycled, so that the insurers can evaluate their own risk as well. And why so? Because there have been cases in the past where uninformed decisions have led to financial or reputational damage. Now, all these cases listed on this slide are well published. It is available on, if you do a Google search. But the consequences is, if the ship owner knowingly or unknowingly sends a ship in contravention to any of those regulations, he could be prosecuted. There have been cases in the past, and more recently, there has been cases where implied duty of care has been there. So the cases mentioned in the last one, where the ship owners sold the ship to third-party buyer. The third-party buyer reflagged the ship, sent it to a recycling facility, which was not approved, and then they were prosecuted. So these are the risks around the recycling. And whatever I've mentioned about the ship recycling regulations, as well as the IHM, the need of compiling an IHM, as well as its maintenance, is all compiled, is all mentioned in the recent guide that the UK Club will be coming out with. It is in its last phase of publishing, so watch out this space on our club's website. It will be published soon. With that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you.